Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in just a second here. You are currently in web room number one, and we are going to start today with the illegal release of live bait fish by recreational anglers drives fish pathogen introduction risk in Minnesota. This presentation is by Meg McAkron, a Macer grad fellow, and Dr. Nicholas Phelps. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions today, at the bottom of your screen, if you hover your mouse a little bit, you're going to see kind of two chat bubbles that says Q&A. If you click on there, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in there. And at the end, we're going to be doing some live question and answer with Meg and Nick. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the presentation, you can put that in the chat, which is the single chat button, or the single chat bubble. We're really excited to share our research with you today. And don't worry, we are recording this presentation. So if you feel like you miss anything, or if you want to view this presentation again, because it's so fabulous, don't worry, we're going to upload it to our MASIG research channel after the showcase. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Meg and Nick.
All right, thank you, Kristen. I'm going to get things kicked off here. I'm Nick Phelps, and like Kristen said, with me is Meg McAkron. She is a PhD candidate in my lab and gets the credit for a lot of the hard work that's going to be presented here. I'm going to start, though, with just introducing the situation and acknowledge those who have been working with us to get this work done. We've had a lot of people here at the University of Minnesota with specialized expertise in survey design, social science, and risk assessments, as well as the Minnesota DNR and other folks who have been instrumental in guiding this work. All right, so if we've learned the nature of this talk has changed a lot in the last year and a half. If we've learned anything from COVID-19 and the emergence of a virus at global scales, it's how unbelievably connected the world really is. And it's not just people. Over the last 50 years, the trade of live animals globally has expanded dramatically. And it's, this activity has resulted in the spread of many of the infamous invasive species that are causing huge problems around the world. One of the most significant threats to global conservation have their sources back to invasive species spread through the live animal trade. And it's not just the animals that we need to worry about. They carry pathogens as well. And we've seen this play out at global and local scales. Here in this image is the chytrid fungus that's spread around the world, causing huge population problems for frogs. You may have heard of white nose disease in bats that's being spread in somewhat similar ways. These sort of global pandemics in people can also happen in animals. And it's something that we know much less about. And perhaps most concerning are those pathogens that can move around through these different networks in asymptomatic hosts. And once introduced, apparently healthy individual can spread disease to a naive population, causing big problems. And while we have concerns at global levels, here in Minnesota, we've got similar situations that I think we ought to be paying attention to as well. We all know Minnesota's culture is tied heavily to recreational fishing, and that's a pastime that we all cherish. An important piece of that activity is the use of live bait fish. I'll just quickly give you a sense of where the bait fish come from and how they move through a supply chain, and then we'll get into the hazards that they might introduce. But if you're not aware, in Minnesota for the last 50 years or so, it's been required that all bait that's used for angling is either produced or harvested within Minnesota. So it's all an in-state source. The majority of the minnows are coming from wild harvest, being caught from shallow, highly productive water bodies or streams They're being moved through wholesale networks or direct to bait shops where anglers can purchase it. This activity, this first step of the supply chain, is obviously an important aspect, but not one that we're going to focus on for the duration of the talk. So I'll just summarize quickly that first step has regulatory protocols in place to limit the introduction of invasive species. There are regulations that restrict when and where bait can be harvested because of infested water status. And there's some disease testing, but the vast majority of fish move through this supply virtually unregulated and with very little oversight. So once at the bait shop, and for the duration of this talk, we're going to use these images to keep track of each step. This is the bait shop logo here. So an angler goes to the bait shop, purchases the bait, then they eventually go use the bait. And what has been a known risk factor for a long time has been the intentional release of unused bait. So you've heard this, the dispose activity that's recommended at all landings. It's part of the standard best management practices for AIS prevention. But yet previous research has suggested that a not so insignificant number of people are releasing those bait fish. And so understanding sort of this pathway, the risks therein to sort of that last step of what gets introduced to a water body is where we're beginning the story. And the reason that this is becoming more and more important is in the last 5 years, there's been a lot, and this is just a quick grab, but there's been a lot of studies that have looked at the hazards within the local bait fish supply here in Minnesota and elsewhere in the Great Lakes region. And long story short, we know that there are pathogens that are out there. Not all of them bad, but some of them do have some significant consequences if they're moved through this supply chain. So going back to this sort of stage from the shop to the shore, we do know that there are some hazards. So the potential for pathogens to exist in the supply. Understanding and quantifying this risk has been a challenge for many. Just, on the surface, we have millions of bait fish with minimal disease testing and biosecurity, very low traceability from these wild-caught sources. We have a lot of anglers moving around the landscape in highly transient and dynamic ways, purchasing bait from a variety of sources and going to many others. And we have many lakes that are potential sources for intentionally released bait. So this creates a potential pathway for the spread of pathogens. Now, before we sort of jump to easy answers here, I want to stress that bait is not only culturally important to Minnesota and our pastime of recreational fishing, but economically as well, and supports a multi-million-dollar aquaculture industry, and the recreational fishing industry is valued in the billions. So this isn't a sort of negligible risk pathway. The decisions that need to or could be made have some pretty significant consequences. And complicating matters is a shortage of some bait species like golden shiners, at least seasonally here in the state, increasing conversations for allowing importation from outside of Minnesota. That introduces different types of risks, and all of the sort of risk questions, whether you're, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of risk tolerance, has been poorly defined in the past and has led to this big tangled mess that we are faced with right now. So we're trying to make management decisions without a lot of great information. And it begs the question, what is the risk of fish pathogen spread via illegal release of live bait fish by anglers? Now, this is central to many of the ongoing management conversations, and Meg has set out to try to answer this during the course of her PhD, and she's going to get into some of those specific pieces of information right now.
Thank you, Nick, for setting that up. And hopefully by the end of the talk, I will have convinced you that we have at least the pieces necessary to go about actually answering this question and solving this issue. So as we've been talking throughout the talk so far, there's this pathway that exists, and each of the steps in the pathway have to occur in order for a diseased fish to spread along that pathway. The pathogen has to exist in live bait fish. It can't be, if it can't be transmitted by live bait fish, it's not really of interest for this question, although of course other types of fish can spread disease. The angler has to buy those fish, and then crucially, they have to take them to the lake or river and release them into the water. I like to address this here because I get this question every single time. What about just using live bait fish? Is that risky? And while there is some risk associated with simply using live bait fish, and there could be incidental transmission from a fish accidentally getting off the hook or maybe being eaten by a predator fish, the fact is that releasing live fish who are then able to spread the disease further and actually create a population of diseased fish potentially in the water is a much higher risk for the spread of disease. And bait fish release is illegal in Minnesota. So that is the behavior of interest for our project moving forward. So I like to kind of break down the overall question into 4 separate questions. First, what are the pathogens out there that we should be most concerned about? Secondly, what is the frequency of angler behaviors that allow the pathogens to propagate along the pathway? Third, what is the risk, the actual quantified risk of those fish pathogens spreading along the pathway via those release behaviors that anglers engage in? And finally, what are the social and psychological determinants that actually predict whether or not anglers are going to release their live bait fish? I have a lot of slides that you might have seen last year if you were at the showcase last year, and we have published recently in a number of journals. So I'm going to treat these at a fairly high level, but please ask questions at the end if you have them, and I'd be happy to follow up with anyone if you want a more detailed explanation. But just to kind of give you an overview of where we are at to date. We know, as Nick mentioned, that there are a number of non-target species and pathogens that have been found in bait fish across the Midwest, including in Minnesota. In our own lab, we found in a survey of allegedly golden shiners across the state that, yes, there were golden shiners in every lot, but there were a number of other not golden shiner species present in those lots, including non-bait fish species like yellow perch. Thankfully, we didn't find any invasive species, but other bait surveys have found that in the past in other states. And we found a number of viruses and bacteria, including some novel, previously uncharacterized viruses that we discovered in the live bait fish. But faced with an impossible number of pathogens, managers need a way to figure out which ones are going to be most important. If you have a limited amount of money to spend on testing and regulating, you want to make sure you're getting the ones that are actually going to present the greatest harm. So we developed a framework and consulted with local resource managers to identify and scope the problem, to put bounds on the question. Like I said before, if it can't be carried in live bait fish, still an important pathogen, but not for the purposes of this project. So we put some bounds on it. Then we integrated stakeholder expert opinion and scientific data from the literature and from previous studies to identify the most important pathogens and then score and rank them according to their risk that they could present to wild fish. Taken together, this created a decision support tool that helps managers prioritize which pathogens are going to be of greatest importance. So on the right side here, you can see the result of that analysis. We have an average risk score for the pathogen along the x-axis, and we also calculated uncertainty associated with the pathogen, because for a lot of these diseases, we don't actually have a lot of information. And as you can see, these 3 pathogens out to the right here kind of separated themselves from the group as being the highest risk pathogens. And that included viral hemorrhagic septicemia virus, Oviplea ovariae, which is a microsporidian parasite of golden shiners, and a new pathogen that's kind of on the horizon, not known to be here yet, Asian fish tapeworm. Secondly, we had to understand the frequency of risky behaviors that allow the pathogens we just discussed to propagate along the pathway. As I said before, an angler has to use live bait fish, purchase a fish that's susceptible to that disease, purchase a fish that's actually infected with that disease, and then critically release that infected fish into the water. If all of these steps occur, we consider this a risky trip, or a trip that results in the release of an infected fish. If any of these things doesn't occur, we have these little off-ramps, and we say, if they're not purchasing fish or they're not buying an infected fish, it doesn't matter what they do with the fish at the end in some ways, because there's no potential for the spread there. So in order to actually understand how frequently these behaviors were occurring, we did an angler survey in 2019. We got 671 responses from resident and non-resident annual license holders across the country. And we found that unfortunately 20% of surveyed bait users admitted releasing their leftover live bait fish. So although a majority were doing the right thing, 1 in 5 were releasing their live bait fish into the water. We combined this information from the angler survey with previous information from other studies and hypothetical or theoretical distributions for disease prevalence and things like that. And we assigned each step in the pathway a probability of occurrence according to that data. When you multiply these probabilities of occurrence together, you can get the probability of all of them occurring, given that each step before had occurred. Because again, we want to understand what the probability of that risky trip occurring is. And it's not risky, or it's not considered risky, if any one of those steps in the chain is broken. Then we actually do what's called stochastic modeling, where we calculate that probability hundreds of thousands of times and then build out this distribution of the average amount of risky trips plus some uncertainty bounds around it, because we have uncertainty in the inputs that we're looking at. And so each time we do the model iteration, it's either a 1 if the step occurs or a 0 if the step does not occur. And you'll notice if any one of these columns is a 0, the trip is considered not risky. But if we have a model iteration, a simulation where there's 1s in every single one of these columns, boom, risky trip, and we mark that and count that in our number of risky trips. So we did this stochastic risk assessment model approach using that angler provided data that I talked about from the survey, and assessed disease introduction risk under a range of potential and sometimes current management scenarios. We have a lot of data for this. I'm only showing one comparison here because we have a lot of different things and I want to make sure to get to everything in the talk. But for your information, this is the result of the risk assessment for Ovipliostophora oberea, that pathogen or parasite I was telling you about before. And in the blue, you can see the current scenario, or what's currently happening in Minnesota based on what we know about the pathogen prevalence and the rate of angler release. We found that on average, about 324,000 introductions could be happening in a given year of fishing in Minnesota, given the current conditions of this pathogen prevalence in the live bait supply, as well as the rate of angler release. However, when we introduced a potential management scenario where we reduced the prevalence or the probability of an infected fish occurring in the live bait supply by 50%, the number of introductions dropped to under 200,000. So we can see that potential management strategies could work to reduce the number of introductions. However, you'll notice that that number isn't 0. We still have some fish getting released on the landscape. And we found, again, across all scenarios, not just OVO, the proportion of anglers releasing live bait fish is a major determinant of overall risk. These numbers might be kind of confusing, but basically the higher up on this graph it is, the more important it is for determining the overall risk. And you'll see that P6, that value right there, the second bar down, that's the probability of an angler releasing their live bait fish. And across all the scenarios we looked at, that was one of the most important factors in determining overall risk. So we have to understand a little bit more about that behavior. Why are anglers releasing their live bait fish? To summarize kind of what we've covered so far before I dive into that question, first, we were able to identify the hazards of greatest concern, and we found that OVO, Asian fish tapeworm, and VHSV were the pathogens of greatest concern for Minnesota under the current scenarios. The great thing about our decision tool is it can be updated as new information becomes available. So as more data comes in, we can recalculate those rankings, and maybe one of those pathogens will drop out and another one will be higher priority. Secondly, we found that 70% of Minnesota anglers reported using live bait, and unfortunately, 1 in 5 of them reported releasing their live bait fish at least one time. When we did our stochastic risk modeling, we found that a high rate of release presents an opportunity for disease spread across the state. And finally, I want to take a little bit of time to dive into this question. We just got survey results back and are working through those, but I'll explain them in a bit. We want to know what are the reasons, what are the social and psychological determinants for anglers releasing that live bait fish, because that is such a critical weakness in our defense. So in order to answer that question, we actually did another angler survey this past spring and summer. This one was even bigger than the last one. We contacted 8,000 anglers and got about 1,400 responses. Our preliminary results include the fact that 75% of anglers said that they plan to use live bait fish. So fairly similar to our last survey, where about 72% of anglers said that they did use live bait fish. We also asked anglers, how important is it for you to be able to use live bait fish in Minnesota? Because as Nick said, bait fish aren't just a risk, they're also a benefit. They're hugely culturally and economically important in the state. Unsurprisingly, about 70% of anglers said it was at least moderately important for them to use live bait, and 429 actually said it was extremely important for them to use live bait fish. So for these people, they might be more motivated to do things to keep live bait fish available and safe and legal to use in the state. In terms of releasing leftover live bait fish, 614 out of the people who answered this question reported that they never released their leftover live bait fish. So that's good, a majority. But 21 out of that 1,400 said that they always did. And unfortunately, 38% of respondents who used live bait fish reported that they released at least once in the last 12 months. Some of those, said that they did it rarely or sometimes, but they did it at least once in the last 12 months. However, on the flip side, when we asked them about future behaviors, only 15% said that they slightly, moderately, or strongly agreed that they plan to release leftover live bait fish in the future. So what's the difference? Why in the past do they admit to releasing their live bait fish, but they actually don't really plan to do it in the future? Well, we started to kind of dig into this a little bit. And thus far, what we found is that it didn't seem like anglers having more time at the end of the fishing trip was really important. They didn't feel like they were pressed for time in terms of releasing or not. They also didn't seem to care too much about the suffering of live bait fish. We previously thought that was a big factor because some folks had said they felt it was cruel to dump them out. But in this bigger, broader study, we didn't find that to be a factor as much. However, we did find that 20% of anglers did not know what the recommended disposal method was. And that seems like a really obvious place to make a difference, to actually improve angler education and share what the recommended disposal method was. Additionally, a majority of anglers strongly agreed that knowing regulations and having a convenient disposal place would help them properly dispose of their live bait fish. So it could be that anglers don't plan necessarily to release their live bait fish, but when they get there, they don't really know what to do, and there isn't a place for them to dispose of it properly. Additionally, preliminary results from our study of theory of planned behaviors suggest that social norms may play a stronger role than attitudes. In other words, what other anglers are doing or what they think other anglers are doing is going to be a bigger predictor for an angler choosing not to release their leftover live bait fish. So in conclusion, better education, better communication with anglers, and perhaps providing disposal stations could be an opportunity to reduce this risk moving forward. And our future analyses, we hope will include, or they will include, a test of how these factors change across different types of anglers in the population, so we can make more targeted messaging and communication aimed at those riskiest actors. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I know I went through a lot. Again, please reach out to me or Nick after the talk if you want an even more detailed approach. We have a lot of material on this and only a couple minutes to get through it. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions now.
All right, again, folks, if you want to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, you can type in questions for Meg and Nick. While you're typing, I do have a question for you to get things started. I'm curious, was there anything that surprised you when you were going through this study? Was there any maybe analysis that you weren't expecting that you could talk about a little bit?
Yeah, I think what I talked about right at the end there, where, like a good number, almost 40% of anglers admitted that they had released live bait fish in the past. That was surprising because our previous survey was only about 20%, but the way we phrased the question changed. In our previous survey, we said, what methods do you use? And then they checked some boxes. This time we asked, how frequently do you do each of these methods? And asking the question that way revealed, well, maybe I rarely release my leftover live bait fish. So that's kind of surprising to find an even higher prevalence of people doing it at least once. And like I said, only 15% said that they planned to do that. So there's something about what happens at the lake or the river that makes them maybe change their plans for what they wanted to do with their live bait fish. So that was surprising to me to see the difference between this year's survey and last year or 2 years ago survey and their planned behavior.
I agree. And I was actually really fortunate to work with both of you, Meg and Nick, on this study a little bit, but could you talk a little bit about the distribution of the survey? Because I think that might be interesting to some of the attendees as well.
Yeah, sure. So this round, we reached 8,000 anglers and we did what's called a stratified design. So we've tried to get anglers from different subgroups of the population, non-resident anglers who have annual licenses, resident anglers who have annual licenses. And we first reached out to them via mail, sent an email or a paper mail, and then they had a code that they could go online and take the survey with. We also then contacted a subset of those people via email, and that's what Kristen helped with setting up that email. So I think they got 5 communications in total. We really bombarded them with opportunities to take the survey, and a small number, about 20 people requested paper surveys as well. So we had kind of multi-mode approach and got a fairly substantial number of respondents given that very aggressive approach.
Excellent. Can you briefly describe what work remains to be done on this study?
Yeah, so as I kind of showed right at the end there, that diagram of a theory of planned behavior is a theory from social science. And basically the idea is that our behavioral intentions, what we plan or expect to do, is determined by our attitudes towards that behavior, the social norms and kind of, expected behaviors around that behavior. And then finally, our perceived behavioral control, which is our perceived ability to make that choice or not. And so we're actually going to do a formal quantitative evaluation of that theory to see if that theory is helpful in explaining angler behavior. So are there social norms associated with live bait fish release? Are there perceived behavioral controls associated with that? What are anglers' attitudes towards that? And can those things predict their behavioral intent? So that remains to be done more formally. I just kind of showed you guys some high level stuff. Then we're actually going to go back into that quantitative risk assessment that I talked about and say, okay, if we know that these things affect angler behavior, what happens if we modify those things? How does that change the resulting risk across the population? So then we'll take that information from the previous survey, the information from the current survey, which asks all the same questions, how often do you use bait, stuff like that, and put it together into this kind of integrated social and ecological model of risk, and then play God a little bit and say, well, what if we change this factor? What if we change this factor, and calculate the resulting risk? So a lot of work remains to be done. Thank you, attendee, for lighting that little bit of a fire under me.
Absolutely. All right. We have lots of questions coming in. Have you thought about looking at the presence or absence of social norms as a predictor for releasing bait fish? Maybe like anglers disposing properly, or have they heard of a well-known angler about proper disposal? So looking at those social norms as a predictor.
Yeah, this is, like I said, the very preliminary stuff I've been able to do so far has suggested that social norms does play a big role. Whether that is a famous angler, or the way we ask the question is, do other anglers like you release their live bait fish? Yes or no? Just kind of get a feel for what people think other people are doing, because that actually is a really important component of social norms. So yes, we are looking at social norms. We also asked a question about trust and a question about where they like to get their information. So kind of combining the information from those questions should get at that answer, like where are anglers getting their information, who do they trust, and how could we leverage that to reduce release behavior?
All right. Were survey respondents representative of all survey strata?
Yes, to some degree. Somewhat unsurprisingly, we had a much higher response rate among older anglers. So we had really low response rate among 18 to 39, it's kind of medium among like 40 to 59, really high response rate in the 60 to 70 range. And then the 70+ just completely dropped off. I don't know, maybe they don't use a computer or something, but at any rate, what we're getting around that by doing what's called post survey weighting. And actually, because we have the information on the whole population of potential respondents, we can kind of do a little bit of special statistical magic after the fact to say, yeah, we didn't get as many young people responding as we wanted to, but we can do a post-survey weighting to actually account for that. So pretty representative, definitely missing some categories, and we're going to account for that in the analysis.
I'm going to combine a couple questions here. So what does NASERC recommend for disposal of bait? And do you recommend disposal stations at lake accesses?
That is a good question. I'm going to defer a little bit to the folks at DNR who are working on this. I don't know if any of them are on the call, but Tina Fitzgerald is at Minnesota DNR, and they have been working on a number of pilot programs where they actually employed things like live bait stations, special labeling on bait buckets and bait bags, things like that, to see what anglers responded to. So I don't know the results of those studies, but I would defer to them on kind of what works best. I think having a disposal station is probably better than nothing, but beyond that, I don't know really what works very well.
Right. Scrolling down. Yeah, we've got a couple comments about different counties doing some bait disposal stations.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. The counties are doing some really cool work, and I'll be watching that closely for sure.
Lots of comments. I'm looking for a question in here.
Meg, I'll turn a comment into a question here. Hans has a comment about non-response bias, which, we've talked about that a lot. You want to describe that?
Yeah. So the question is, we sent out 8,000 surveys. We only get 1,400 back. What is going on with those other people? I will say one factor that I didn't account for in here is some of those survey invitations weren't even deliverable. We had several hundred just come back because the address isn't updated, even though we used the most recent address database, like they just didn't get there. So that accounts for it a tiny bit. But this issue of non-response bias is like huge in the world of surveys, and kind of the world of surveys is a little bit in crisis. Like, what do we do about people not responding to the surveys? So we have a couple ways of accounting for that. One, like I said, we designed our survey sample knowing that some groups were going to respond less. So we oversampled certain categories of anglers, knowing that they were less likely to respond to get adequate representation. We're also going to do this post-survey weighting where we say, okay, we know that, younger people were less likely to respond, but they were also more likely to release. So those answers that we did get are going to be worth more in the analysis to kind of balance some of that out. Beyond that, we're kind of out of luck. We're going to do what we can given the post-survey weighting. We did what we could in the design and the actual methodology to get as many responses as possible. But beyond that, that is a huge struggle for survey designers and people who do survey research. I tend to agree with your comment that the people who are not responding are likely the ones breaking the law. The only thing I have about that is that, since so many of them didn't know the law, they might not know that they shouldn't be doing that, and they might not be afraid of responding. That's called social desirability bias, where you say what you think you should say instead of what you actually think. And because so many people don't know what the law is, they're less likely, I think, to fall into that. That being said, point well taken, non-response is a huge issue, and we're doing what we can to address it, but it's not perfect.
I have a very interesting question. Is the bait water a risk? You're looking at bait fish, but is the water itself a risk as well?
Yeah, definitely. I'll say a little bit about it, but maybe Nick, you can talk from like a more pathogen oriented side. Definitely bait water, what you're getting from the bait shop. It should be sort of clean, but isn't always. And so there are regulations associated with moving the water as well. When you are refreshing your water in the lake, and you're then going to go to a different lake or take your fish home, you have to swap your water out. So just as a PSA to everybody, always bring a jug of dechlorinated water, or if you have a well at the launch or something like that, you can use that. It is definitely a risk. We did not look at that particular behavior. Again, we're looking at the illegal release of live bait fish, because the actual physical fish, like hosting all those viruses and pathogens, is going to be a really powerful vector for disease. But that's not to say that the water is not also a risk. Did you want to say anything, Nick, about potential invasive species spread in water or anything like that?
No, I think he answered it well there. The fish can definitely shed pathogens into the water, and therefore water might be a risk, but not nearly as much as the host itself. The regulations that are in place for not transporting water once you leave a lake are more for invasive species that might be in there. So zebra mussel veligers or spiny water flea, something like that, which we know can live in that bait bucket and get moved as well. So still an important risk factor, but not one that we looked here from the pathogen standpoint.
So that question leads into this one rather nicely. So in general, he said, or this person believes that fishermen have good relationships and trust with the bait shops that they use. Maybe this is because they assume that they're regulated by the state and what they're buying is, quote, safe. Do you think that this could be a reason that they release the live bait? And do you think you have any evidence of this theory that you could share?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, this is something that just this past summer I started to get really interested in, was this relationship with bait shops. Because as you said, previous research and just anecdotally, everyone kind of likes the local bait shop and they trust them for information on fishing and things like that. So we're actually embarking on a project to understand how bait fish retailers feel about some of these things. And I think the ultimate question is, how can we leverage that relationship to help make that trust turn into something that actually protects from invasive species release? So I do think that in large part, anglers just don't think about, the potential risk. They're just not aware of it. They don't really think about it. And it would be my opinion, a good route to pursue, a way of certifying clean bait, having some way of knowing there's no pathogens, there's no invasive species. Because it's already assumed, we might as well do that. But that obviously requires significant cost and infrastructure and things like that. So I do think, though, that there is like a certain trust there that we can leverage to manage risk.
Perfect. So there was a little bit of discussion about kind of distributing the information to anglers, but could you touch on again of maybe recommended ways to talk to anglers about proper disposal methods, or maybe how to expand this study for recommended ways to expand that educational outreach portion?
Yeah, this is one thing we're kind of hoping to address with the theory of planned behavior analysis coming up. One of the things we asked about was their attitudes towards the behavior. And part of attitudes is the expected outcome, whether you think a good or a bad outcome is going to come from doing the behavior. And we have explicit sets of questions asking anglers, what do they think is going to happen after they release their live bait fish? And what we found in previous surveys, and a little bit so far in this one, is they actually think they're doing a good thing. They think that they're improving the fish populations, they're not wasting them, all these different things. And so I think just addressing the simple facts that it is illegal, it doesn't bolster fish populations, it actually potentially spreads invasive species and disease, that can go a long way. So I would say, in terms of communication, education only isn't going to change it. I think we probably need enforcement and other layers of kind of risk management. But like just basic fact communication will go a long way in reducing risks, just based on what we've seen so far.
Is there any bait fish release information given out when you get a fishing license? I don't think there is there?
It's not printed on the license or anything, but it is in the fishing regulations handbook. I think it could be, even more obvious. Don't release fish. I mean, it's in a lot of places in the handbook, and you'll maybe get to a lake and there's that giant wood sign with all the different invasive species information and launching information and park hours and where the restrooms are, and down in the corner maybe don't release live bait, or maybe there's a bait disposal trash can. But I think a clear message like we have like Clean Drain Dry or Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers, like including live bait fish release, and that could be really powerful because it's so punchy and like to the point. So in short, the information is available, but it's kind of hidden sometimes in other info.
Yeah. I got a couple comments. Doug mentions he saw a couple studies on social norms as predictors. Others take actions was deemed effective by 90% of responders in both studies. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's what I found so far. Again, I've done some really preliminary stuff, and I thought perceived behavioral control was going to be like the big predictor, but so far it seems like social norms actually is. So that's really interesting. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, Alicia O'Hare, she said several counties have put out some bait disposal stations, and it could be interesting if there's a question to see if they've been used, maybe kind of like if they're using it, a comparison there.
Yeah, I'm hoping the counties are collecting or were collecting that type of data as well, like to get that really local level, like before and after they were put out, did people use them? Like, I think that would be really interesting. We didn't ask that in our survey though, but that would be super cool.
Next phase of the project, right, Meg?
Yes. 7-year PhD.
Yeah, we've gone to clean, drain, dispose as a DNR message.
Yeah, that's right. I've seen that. And I think that is really helpful.
That's a good point. And then we have a comment kind of about bait shop retailers being held accountable for what they're supplying as well. And I'm not very familiar with the regulations there, but I would assume that's kind of built into the system. I'm not sure. Can you speak to that a little bit? Is there any testing that goes into the bait that's commercially available?
Nick, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, as far as I know, the bait shop is not responsible for what moves through the supply that they sell. So they're relying on their source, the bait fish producer or harvester. They give them the fish and then they sell it out the door. I think it's prudent that and I think part of this comment, I think it's important that they are part of that messaging, being a trusted source, but there, as far as I know, aren't regulatory implications for what they do or don't do at that step in the supply chain. But yeah, it's as Meg alluded to, we're looking at bait shops here very shortly. We're going to be administering a couple surveys to that audience, and we'll maybe get some perspective on their options or interest here shortly.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one last question, and has there been any outreach in terms of like the social norms to reach out to fishing guides or fishing shows to help promote the proper disposal of live bait fish?
Yeah, I'm hoping that the evidence that we find in the next couple of months here in our analysis will hopefully give people the fuel they need to decide which of those might be best. Like I said, we're going to kind of see where do they get their information? How do they like their information delivered? If it's something like, Ron Shera is like Angler's favorite person, and then maybe we get Ron Shera to, talk about this or something like that. So that's definitely part of the next couple of steps here, is figuring out what would be the best kind of modes of communication and whether there's this kind of celebrity effect that could happen. I know that a lot of water conservation districts and counties and local authorities are doing lots of different communication efforts right now. So like I said, I'll be watching those closely too, to see how well they perform. But that's a great idea.
Excellent. Nick or Meg, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to end with?
Just that you can always reach out to me if you want to hear more. I have probably another hour's worth of things to talk about. So just let me know.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Meg and Nick. We're going to open it up for questions. So again, to enter your question at the bottom of the screen there, you'll see a little Q&A button. That's where you'll type in your questions. And to get things started, we actually, in our first session, we had a great question that I think opened up a good discussion. And that was kind of what work still remains to be done? What I think you remember this from last time, but
This is the stressful question.
Yeah.
But
Stressful,
it's a
but
really good
exciting.
one. Yes, it is exciting. Yeah. So what we're going to do with this information. So I'll go back a slide real quick here just to say this theory of planned behavior, like I said, actually is a very well validated, very well known theory from social science. And so the kind of next step is to see basically, does this model help us understand why anglers are doing what they're doing? So we'll actually directly and quantitatively address that using some statistical techniques. So that's the next step. After that, if we can understand kind of what the strength of these arrows, like how strong are attitudes in determining bait release intent, we can start to play what if a little bit and actually put that information back into our quantitative risk model and say, okay, what if I could change angler attitudes? How much of an effect would that have on live bait fish release and overall risk? So next step one is take all this data, crunch it using some fancy stats and say, this is why anglers do what they do. And then take that information and feed it back into our quantitative model. So thanks for that good question.
Absolutely. So we have another question, and it is just out of curiosity, what are the rules in Minnesota surrounding the release or use of fish eggs as bait? Do you know?
I think you can, but Nick, you would probably know more than I would.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to answer that one. I'm not 100% sure. It's the only eggs that are probably big enough for use as bait are trout and salmon. There's a lot of pathogens of trout and salmon that we do care a lot about that are highly regulated non-bait fish things. So if they are allowed to be used, I suspect they'd have to be preserved in a way to try to reduce that risk. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to pull another question from our last session, and that is, can you talk a little bit about the respondents and kind of how the representative breakdowns, like the age range and such of your respondents were?
Yeah, so this previous question in the other session, I think, had to do somewhat with kind of getting around bias in a survey. When you're having participants self-select into a process, that can be a source of bias in your estimates. So we did a couple of things to try to alleviate that. On one hand, in the design of the survey, we oversampled or took more than we would expect proportionally from certain subgroups that we knew from our previous survey didn't respond that much. So for example, we knew that younger anglers under age 40 were less likely to respond, so we oversampled them. Certain areas of the state, like the Northwest, response rate was lower, so we oversampled there. So we did some pre-survey design to account for that. On the back end, once we received the responses, we kind of saw that pattern that we expected. We had younger anglers really did not respond as much. Older anglers in the 50s and 60s responded a lot, and then there was a big drop off after that age group. So the shape was kind of like this of the response curve. We do have that information though of who those non-respondents are. So there's some statistical weighting techniques that we can use after the fact to kind of adjust for that. So thankfully we have that information because we know who the whole angling population is, and we can kind of account for those little weirdnesses in the response rate, even though we did see differential response rates.
Another question for you, and that is, are bait shops sharing the word about release risks, and what would a convenient disposal place look like?
Yeah, I know that bait shops are, sort of the hallowed, respected opinion leaders a lot of times in angling communities. It's always a place where you can kind of learn anything you want, just standing there for a couple of minutes, listening to folks talk. So I think that the bait shops, or kind of the last point of contact before an angler heads out, like that could be a really powerful communication opportunity. As far as I know, some do engage in like distribution of printed materials, or they might have signs hanging at the bait shop. I don't know that there are any sort of organized efforts. That being said, the DNR has some folks working on various kind of pilot studies of communication efforts, including some at bait shops. Those pilot studies also include disposal options. So I have to defer a little bit to DNR on kind of what those disposal options might look like. From my personal experience, I know that just having a place that's like close by the launch or the fishing dock would be helpful. Not having to carry fish very far is always nice, but I'd have to defer to the DNR projects that have been looking at that, and I'll be following those closely.
Excellent. We have
Are you reading that, Kristen?
yeah. Oh, go ahead. If you want
We just got a chat from one of the DNR people. I'm glad you're here, Tina. Results will be available this winter. So I'm excited to see. She says there were 7 pilot projects. So they're doing some great work to actually assess the efficacy of some of these potential solutions. So I'll definitely be watching for that. Thanks, Tina.
Hey, Meg, could you talk a little bit about next steps with the bait shops and how you're going to be working with them here shortly?
Yeah, so that was another thing that kind of came out of this, was this understanding that bait shops play an important role, both in terms of reducing risk, but also as these sort of stakeholders in this pathway. And to date, we hadn't included them at all. We were kind of ignoring that front half of the pathway. But recently I started to get interested in this question of benefits, how important live bait fish is to Minnesota. So we are putting together a survey and interview process for live bait fish retailers in Minnesota to try to understand what factors might determine their participation in AIS reduction, as well as understanding kind of the role that they play as members of the community and the financial and economic benefits associated, to kind of answer that question, like, well, what do we do about it? Can we harness this trusting relationship between anglers and bait fish retailers and tap into this really engaged, important stakeholder group to kind of move forward? So I have to click submit on my IRB to get approval for that, and that should be taking place this fall. Looks like Tina also said there's a large group of counties that are distributing bait bags for disposal and extra water. So that's one thing that comes up a lot, is the requirement in Minnesota to not move water between lakes. If you're taking live bait out on the lake, you might have a bait bucket recirculating water through it, and then you actually can't take that lake water with you. So a bait shop will give you a bag or bucket of extra water to swap out when you leave the lake. And it sounds like Otter Tail County might be working on some of that. So thank you.
That's fantastic. Can you talk a little bit about social norms as predictor of releasing bait fish? And then maybe we discussed a little bit of in the last session, what was it? Kind of like that social influencer kind of idea.
Yeah, so I don't have the full results yet, but just based on some of the preliminary analysis I've looked at, it seems like, in this theory of planned behavior, these subjective norms seem to be one of the strongest predictors of behavioral intent, which is a little bit surprising to me. Social norms are understood kind of in multiple different ways, but one common dichotomy is injunctive norms. So what you think people think you should do. So-and-so is really important to me. They think I should release my bait, so I do that. And then there's descriptive norms, which is so-and-so does that. Other anglers release their live bait fish. People I know release their live bait fish. So we assessed both of those different types of norms. And we did find that there was a relationship between subjective norm and intention. So there might be a way, as Kristen alluded to kind of get famous personalities or people that anglers appreciate and listen to say, you should do it this way. I know that a lot of conservation groups can be influential. So that's something we're going to look at as well. If there are certain backcountry hunters and anglers or something like that, some group that was common among anglers that responded to the survey, and see if this idea of like an authority figure or somebody who's popular kind of putting the social pressure on anglers to do the right thing. I haven't dived into that as much as I would like yet, but it's coming.
Excellent. So yeah, I'll leave it open for a couple more minutes while we answer this next question. So if you have any more questions, go ahead, type them in that Q&A. But in the meantime, Meg, in the next 6 months or so, what's on your plate? What are you going to be doing with this project?
Yeah, so this data that I talked about today, again, is pretty just descriptive and high level. What I'm really going to be interested in diving into is this theory of planned behavior. And actually, so all those arrows in the diagram will have numbers associated with them, actually measuring the strength of the relationship between attitudes and intention. We're also going to do what's called structural equation modeling with multi-group SEM. And the multi-group SEM will allow us to test for differences across subgroups of anglers. Are women who are over 40 more likely to behave in a certain way? Are anglers who only go ice fishing likely to behave in a certain way? Things like that. So we'll actually try to figure out what different groups are likely to do. Then, I think I mentioned this before, we'll feed that information back into our quantitative risk model to understand how changes in some of these social and psychological factors could result in changes in risk in the overall landscape. That's kind of like where we get to play God a little bit and say, okay, well, what if we could change behavior in this way? And that would be in the next several months here as we wrap up the project.
Fantastic. Well, before we close, Meg or Nick, do you have anything else you want to add before we end a couple minutes early here?
Nope, I don't. Thanks everyone for joining. And
Yeah, thanks everybody. I can't see like who's in the group or how many there are or anything, but thank you.
Yeah, and don't hesitate to reach out to Meg or I if you have got questions or interested in chatting about this further.
Yeah, please.